Welcome to today's webinar with Dr. Robert Ackerman. This is our ninth and final presentation in the 2015 series entitled Understanding Addiction and Supporting Recovery, which has been sponsored by the Clergy Education and Training Project of NACoA, the National Association for Children of Alcoholics. You are in for a real treat today with our presenter, Dr. Ackerman. But first, let me do a few introductory comments. My name is Sis Wenger. I am NACoA's President and CEO and your host for this series. We are grateful to our co-sponsors for their collaboration in this educational project. The American Association of Pastoral Counselors, the Association for Clinical Pastoral Education, the National Alliance for Drug-Endangered Children, and the Entertainment Industries Council, which is providing the technical support for our presentations throughout this series. The entire series of 9 one-hour webinars has been supported by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Now, however, I would like to introduce you to your speaker for today. Dr. Robert Ackerman is the immediate past editor of Counselor, the magazine for addiction professionals, and he is now the chair of its advisory board. But more than that, he had for years been a professor of sociology at the University of South Carolina in Beaufort and also at the University of Indiana in Pennsylvania, where he also created and directed the Mid-Atlantic Addiction Treatment Institute for years and provided a phenomenal amount of information to our field through that research work at the Institute. As an author, he has published numerous articles and research findings and is best known for writing the first book in the United States on children of alcoholics. 12 books later, many television appearances, and countless speaking engagements later, he has become internationally known for his work with families and children of all ages impacted by addiction. His books have been translated into 13 languages. Dr. Ackerman has served on many advisory boards and is on the NACoA advisory board, actually, and is one of our co-founders. He has worked with the National Institute of Mental Health, the National Institute on Alcoholism and Alcohol Abuse, and the United States Department of Education. He served on the White House Task Force on Resiliency and At-Risk Youth and participated in one of the many of the expert panels that NACoA had in developing core competencies for clergy and other pastoral ministers that have served us well over the years. Dr. Ackerman is a recipient of many awards, including the University Professor Award and Professor Emeritus from the Indiana University of Pennsylvania, the Distinguished Alumni Awards from both Western Michigan University and the University of North Colorado, and Louisiana State University. He received the 2006 Special Recognition Award from the U.S. Journal of Alcohol and Drug Dependence and the 2008 Father Martin Appreciation Award. He is a veteran of numerous TV appearances, and his work has been featured on CNN, Headline News, the New York Times, the Today Show, USA Today newspaper, and Newsweek magazine, Oprah, and other social media. Dr. Ackerman, on a personal level, has been a very caring supporter of NACoA in the 33 years of its existence, and as I mentioned earlier, was one of his co-founders. His name and the name of Dr. Claudia Black, who you heard from earlier in this series, is on the NACoA's coveted Ackerman Black Award, given to the rare people who have developed and contributed to children of alcoholics work for their entire career. It's a real privilege for me to introduce you to our good friend, and probably a good friend to many of you, is Dr. Robert Ackerman. Bob?
Sis, thank you very, very much for the kind words, and thanks for remembering some of the things that I did quite some time ago. As you probably can imagine, when people ask me what I'm the most proud of, I think it's the Children of Alcoholics book that I wrote so long ago. Thank all of you for tuning in to the webinars, and whether or not you are a clinical professional, clergy, pastoral counseling, working with addicted families, or maybe you're an adult child yourself. I certainly thank you very, very much for taking your time to be part of today. One of the first things, however, I'd like to do is to welcome you to something else, and that is to welcome you to the middle of Recovery Month. As most of you know, this September, as always September, is Recovery Month, and I think during this month there are two things that we really need to do. One is to spread the word about recovery, spread the word that, hey, treatment works, you know, and the other thing is that, and what is near and dear to me is I believe that everyone whose life is touched by addiction, whether it is the addict herself or himself, but especially family members and certainly children, is that everyone's life who is touched by addiction has the right to recovery. And I hope that you believe that, and I hope that you can get many other people through your work to believe that as well. One of the things that we're going to talk about, and what I was asked to talk about, is gender issues regarding adult daughters of alcoholics that I wrote about and called Perfect Daughters, and adult sons of alcoholics. And that would be what I referred to as silent sons. I'd just like to share with you a little bit about what's the research behind that, so you have some idea of what I'm talking about when I cite some of the findings. Perfect Daughters was really about adult daughters of alcoholics, and that book was based on a study where there were 624 self-identified daughters of alcoholics through various ways to do that, and also 585 women who were raised in non-alcoholic families. So basically what I was able to do was to compare women to women. Silent Sons, which I wrote after Perfect Daughters. Silent Sons has about the same format, 215 self-identified adult sons of alcoholics, 206 men who are from non-alcoholic families. However, in Silent Sons, I also interviewed about 100 women who were involved with Silent Sons, either as their mom, their sister, their husband, their lover, partner, or whatever it happened to be, to add a dimension about somebody else's perception about Silent Sons. So before I get to just talking about the gender issues, I wanted to perhaps have us start with something else, and that is why survivors of alcoholic families are not all the same. Years ago, or even now, whenever I present, I'm often amazed to share with people that, I've met more adult children of alcoholics whose siblings are not adult children of alcoholics. That's a pretty neat trick. In other words, we got 4 people growing up from the same family, 4 different outcomes and 4 totally different perceptions of what's going on. Years ago, I wrote a book called Same House, Different Homes, which was why adult children are not all affected the same way. But what I have narrowed it down to is about 8 different variables to explain why we are not all affected the same way, and I want to go through them relatively quickly because I want to get to the issues of gender. But the first one of these has to do with what is the degree of dysfunction in the parental role, obviously due to the addiction. And what we're getting at here is how much does this addiction really impair the ability of that alcoholic to be a healthy parent. We also know in our research that children of alcoholics have just as many issues with that non-alcoholic parent as they do with the alcoholic parent. Secondly, we can look at, or what I looked at was what is the type or kind of dysfunctional parent or parents that someone had while she or he was growing up. Type refers to the personality type of the parent or parents. Kind refers to the kind of behaviors that that parent exhibited, particularly toxic behaviors, particularly when someone was intoxicated or inebriated. For example, there's a big difference between living with an alcoholic who treats everything in life as if it's a big joke versus an alcoholic who, boy, they don't come in the house, they kick the door down on their way into the house, versus an alcoholic who's very, very belligerent, as opposed to an alcoholic who is very, very passive. So, and in listening to people, you know, when I was doing the research is really a combination of quantitative and qualitative research, because I did a tremendous amount of interviews, and sometimes that qualitative information that we find adds greatly to the quantified information. So the way in which people talked about their parent really began to tell me a lot. The third thing that causes a lot of difference is different reactions to stress. How do people handle stress? For example, one of the things that I found out is that if an adult child has problems, these problems are often most likely to surface when she or he is under stress. Now, I say if they have problems, and maybe I could give you a little sidebar here. I'm not one of these people who thinks that adult children of alcoholics are walking catastrophic personality defective people. You know, come on, give me a break. There are many, many, many healthy adult children of alcoholics. And whether or not people have healed is one thing, but we do know that they've changed. But what I found out in my research is if they have problems, they are most likely to have these problems when they are, in fact, under stress. And this occurs for children, too. If you work with children of alcoholics, you're not sure what to do, help the children learn to handle stress, and you will, in fact, be contributing a lot. A fourth variable is personality or perceptions, and that is our personality. You know, it's the old, is the glass half empty or half full? Some people say, hey, you know, it's both. And then our perceptions, and this is really where we get to have different viewpoints in families, isn't it? That we all don't perceive the thing the same way. I've run into more people who, and more siblings who argue mom was alcoholic and someone else perceives, no, she wasn't. So, you know, that's what I'm talking about. A fifth variable would be gender implications and how we interpret based on our gender, and we're going to come back to that because that's what today is about. The sixth one has to do with our age and our developmental factors, and that is, you know, children of alcoholics still experience normal human development and normal human developmental crisis that we all need to balance off. The other thing I was concerned about is how old was the child when the alcoholism started, as well as perhaps how old was the child maybe when the individual got into recovery. One of the things that I did find that if adult children have problems, that those problems were most likely to focus during the decade of their 30s. Isn't that interesting? But on the other hand, what I found out in the control group is that it's during our 30s that we're faced with a lot of stress: parenting, jobs, finance, education, children growing up. And so, you know, and our parenting. So this is also when, the same time when COA said that there were some problems. The other thing that was interesting based on gender was the age at which an adult child said, at this age I admitted that my parent was alcoholic. The average age was around 14 years. However, if it was the father who was alcoholic, usually the adult child said, I knew that, I really admitted that by age 12. But if it was mom who was alcoholic, they said, I really didn't want to admit that until I was about 18 or 19. So wanting to deny it in mom really lasted a lot longer than wanting to deny it in your father. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Our seventh variable are our cultural considerations, those things about us and our diversity, whether our diversity is environmental, whether it's religious, whether it's race, whether it's ethnicity. I don't know about you, but when people are in pain, especially in pain, they would like to be seen for who they are. And our cultural diversity has a lot to do with how we see things, and certainly this is true for alcoholic families as well. And then finally, our eighth one is what I call offsetting contributing factors. And these usually fall into about two categories. It can be people, who've made contributing factors in our lives, not just significant others, but contributing factors, positive things in our lives. We know in all of our research over and over and over again about the lives of children of alcoholics that one of the most positive things that served as an offsetting factor for children was having a healthy adult in their life who was interested in the child and took time for that child. Other offsetting factors can be institutions. It could be organizations that are designed to help families. It could be, for example, our religious organizations that are designed to help families. It could be school. It could be education. It could be healthcare. All of these are organizations. I know for me, a tremendous powerful offsetting factors for me, one was my grandmother, who I was at least able to talk with about what was going on in our family. And the other thing that was very powerful for me was school. I genuinely liked school, and because in school I felt I could be my own person and that I could get out from under the shadow of alcoholism. So those are just some examples of why not all alcoholic families are the same. But let's get to the topic of the day, and we want to talk a little bit about gender. And where I want to start with that is something like this, if you can just kind of follow my design here on the PowerPoint. Gender identification boundaries. Let's start there. Gender identification boundaries have to do with the way we are socialized about being a boy, being a girl, being female, being male. And even if we are in a society that is very sexist and double standard, we still wind up being socialized, don't we? But let's take this. The A, B, and the C that you have up here could represent three different clients. The A client has something less than the B and the C person. What these represent are very narrow gender identification boundaries. My hypothesis quite simply works like this. The more the person that you're working with adheres to very stereotypic gender boundaries, the more difficult it will be for that individual to work through her or his issues. Let me repeat it. The narrower the gender identification boundaries and the more stereotypic, the more difficult it will be for that person to change. Quite simply, why? Because there isn't a lot of room for change in those very, very narrow boundaries. I see this over and over again. For those professionals and clergy and therapists who are listening to this, you might be trying absolutely everything you possibly can to facilitate change in a person, and no matter what modality you're using, it just isn't working. Well, it might not be you whatsoever. Step back and take a look. The problem might be that the individual has very narrow gender boundaries, and they just don't know how to make that new change work within those boundaries. It has never occurred to them that they need to get out from narrow boundaries. Some of the healthiest people that I know today, their boundaries are almost endless. It's sort of like Eric Fromm's idea, of being fully human, that we know that we have incredible capacities to grow and to stretch our boundaries. So when that person has those very narrow boundaries, we can see that they often struggle with change. The other thing I wanted to give you an example of could be something like this. Gender and self-concept. Some of this and some of the great ideas of self-concept I learned from Lynn Sanford, and Lynn's classic book. Her and Ellen Donovan wrote the book Women and Self-Esteem. Lynn said a great thing and talked about self-concept. She said that self-concept between women and men can be the same, but can also be different. So for example, Lynn said this. She said, what's the same for women and men is often that our self-concept can be very fragmented. But now we've got some differences, and that would be that what we see here is that for women, Lynn thought that our self-concept was often very negatively focused, and that is that women might pick something about themselves that they think needs improved. Oh, this isn't good enough. This needs to be improved. And what she said was a great example of this is Madison Avenue and advertising. If you've ever watched women's products, they're really marketed to women in very, very fragmented ways. if your hair was this way, if your eyes were this way, if your thighs were this way. And what do they want you to do? They want you to change that part according to some standard. And then, of course, then to confuse you, they change the standard every year. But, what's the message to women? Is that message that you're never good enough? You have to keep changing and changing. So women are more likely to focus on something that's negative about themselves. I know it's sexist and it's not fair, but that seems to be what's there. Men, we also have a fragmented self-concept, but we are more likely to focus on what I call image-enhancing self-concept, and that is we're more likely to focus on something that we think we do well. And I say, well, if I do that, fine, I must be okay. So a lot of men, they'll focus, for example, on their occupations. Well, if I'm good at my job, I must be a good guy or something like that. So we are more likely to focus on something that we do. Women might be more likely to focus on something that she believes is negative about herself. Now, let's add one more thing to see if we can really complicate this, and that is let's add about gender and attributing blame. Who or what do we blame when things go wrong? So, again, let's look at women and men, and again, superficially, some of the research out there. When it comes to attributing blame, women disproportionately seem to be internally focused. And if you add the negative self-concept, what is she doing? She's blaming herself, and she's blaming herself because of something that she thinks is negative about herself or a flaw. Men, we on the other hand, are usually more externally focused about attributing blame to something. So, for example, women are much more likely to be very self-critical. And as a matter of fact, for the women who are listening, do you ever blame yourself for stuff that you've had absolutely no control over whatsoever? It really isn't your fault, but somehow you feel that it is. Men, on the other hand, sometimes what we do is we are too critical of other people, or we want to blame some of the things that we do and shouldn't do on situational factors. So if you put that together, we put together self-concept, and we also put the idea of attributing blame. So let's go a little bit further here since we have it, and what we'll start to do is let's look at some of these gender patterns, and I want to start with this, intergeneration gender influences, and that would be our offspring. So today we're talking about adult daughters and adult sons. Two categories. But in reality, it's never that simple. If we really want to understand gender, wouldn't we also want to understand the gender of who's alcoholic? So, for example, we would have mother only, father only, both parents. We know in the case of alcoholism, give or take 1 or 2 percentage points, in about 20% of the cases, it's mother only who's alcoholic. About 60% of the time, it's father only, and about 20% of the time, it's both parents. Okay, so we can see some differences right there. But if I am a daughter or I am a son, that's one level of division. On the other hand, if we want to take into account of who's alcoholic, now we've got another level. So basically what we're going to have now is what we're going to wind up with is looking at 6 categories, right? So now what we have is what we thought it was simple by saying adult or a son. No, it's far more complicated than that. What we're doing is we're really turning around and we're talking about looking at least 6 different categories. So let me ask you this before we go any further. Maybe some of you have already peeked ahead, but if you haven't, don't. For a daughter of an alcoholic, what do you think is most negative for her? This would be from the daughter's point of view. Is it having an alcoholic mother, an alcoholic father, or both parents? On the other hand, what do you think about sons? Which do you think is most negative for a son? Is it having an alcoholic mother, a father, or both parents? Well, let's take a look at this. And if you can follow through on this next slide, let's take a look at this. And that's gender differences of impact on sons and daughters of alcoholics. And in this case, our gender difference would be the parent. So what do we have here? We've got daughters and sons, all right? Now, for daughters ranked having both parents as alcoholic is a much greater problem than either father only or mother only. Sons, on the other hand, The big issue for them is they put having an alcoholic mom as the biggest issue. You know, there's some research out there that has been around for a long time that says if you impair the role of mother, particularly in childhood, it is far more critical for boys than for girls. It doesn't mean it wasn't incredibly painful for girls. We don't have a control mom out there. But in other words, far more critical for boys. So that didn't really surprise me. What did they put second? The daughter put her father second as the second greatest problem of the three. And the son now put both parents as a problem. And then when we look at, okay, what came in third, daughters put their moms third. Now, it doesn't mean that it wasn't incredibly negative to have an alcoholic mom because we don't have a controlled mom out here. But so daughters put her mom, and look what the sons did. Sons put their father third. Now, this is kind of interesting. What they both did is they both put having the opposite gender had a more negative impact. The same gender had a lesser impact. When I looked at the daughters and the sons who had both parents alcoholic, what I found out was they disproportionately identified with the issues of the non-alcoholic parent. And so thus, you know, having, not the non-alcoholic parent, they disproportionately identified with the issue of the opposite gender parent, not the non-alcoholic parent. For example, the daughter with two alcoholic parents disproportionately identified with the issues of her dad, the son with two disproportionately the issues of the mom. So what we'll do is we'll go then to the next slide, which really looks at what do we know about, let's just look at alcoholic mothers.
Okay, Bob.